When Shaquille O'Neal sat down on a wooden bench outside the Roosevelt Community Shelter on West Madison Street in Chicago at 7:14 on the morning of January 9th, nobody looked twice. The coat was a masterpiece of invisibility, a brown canvas parka with a broken zipper, collar turned up. One pocket torn through so the lining hung out like a white flag. The boots were steel-toed and cracked along the left toe box in a specific way that takes years to achieve. The beard was gray, patchy in the way that age and stress and outdoor sleeping combine to produce. And the wool cap was pulled low enough that the architecture of his face, the wide jaw, the particular geography of his cheekbones that had been on billboards in 30 countries, was gone. Just a very large man on a bench, watching the street, breath coming out in small white clouds in the January air. He had a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. He held it the way a person holds the last thing they have. 4 championships, 28,000 career points, a business portfolio that spans real estate, food franchises, and technology investments, with a net worth Forbes most recently placed at over $400 million. None of it was present on that bench. He sat there for 2 hours before anyone spoke to him. The first person was a woman named Cecilia. She was 63, small, wearing a blue parka that had the name of an insurance company embroidered on the chest. A giveaway from somewhere, years ago. She sat down at the far end of the bench without looking at him, opened a brown paper bag, and took out half a sandwich wrapped in foil. She held it toward him without turning her head. "You eat yet?" she said. Shaq looked at the sandwich. He looked at her. "No," he said. She put the sandwich between them on the bench. She kept eating her half. She didn't say another word for 20 minutes. And in that 20 minutes, Shaquille O'Neal sat on a bench on West Madison Street in January and ate half a turkey sandwich, and did not speak, and did not perform, and did not announce himself, and felt something he would later describe to the small crew filming from across the street with a long lens as the most honest 20 minutes I've had in a very long time. Nobody recognized him. The 6 hours that followed would change at least 4 lives in ways that none of those people saw coming. One of them was his own. But before Cecilia sat down on that bench, Shaq had already noticed 3 things about this block that didn't add up. The first was a sign above the soup kitchen door, hand-painted on a piece of plywood, white letters on dark green, slightly crooked on the left side, as if whoever hung it had done it alone. Estelle's table. Est, 1977. The E in Estelle was slightly larger than the other letters, as if it had been repainted after the fact, a correction made to something that mattered. He looked at it for 4 full seconds, filed it, moved on. The second was a photograph taped inside the glass of the soup kitchen's front window, the kind of photograph that has been there so long the tape is yellowed and the edges have curled. 2 women, young, standing in front of what appeared to be a much smaller version of the same building, laughing at something off camera, one of them in a yellow dress. He was on the wrong side of the glass to see it clearly. He did not go closer. He looked at it for 2 seconds, filed it, looked away. The third was a child's drawing, crayon, the kind of drawing a 6 or 7-year-old makes, taped to the inside of the soup kitchen window below the photograph. It showed a table. Around the table were 7 figures of varying sizes, all holding hands. In the top right corner, the child had written, in careful capital letters, 1 word, together. He noticed the drawing. He noticed the word. He said nothing. He sat down on the bench. Now here is the part that nobody on West Madison Street understood that morning. What the diner owner across the street didn't know. What the 2 caseworkers inside the shelter didn't know. What the documentary crew positioned a block south on a camera long enough to read a newspaper headline from 60 yards didn't know was one fact. Shaq had been funding the soup kitchen across the street for 4 years. Not in his name. Through a foundation entity called Pillar Community Partners, one of 11 charitable vehicles his team managed, he had wired $240,000 to the Roosevelt Community Shelter and Estelle's Table over 48 months, covering the soup kitchen's operating costs during a period when its city grant had been cut by 60%. The director of the shelter knew the name Pillar Community Partners. She did not know the name behind it. Nobody on that block knew who was sitting on the bench, and nobody on that block knew yet what Shaq had learned the night before in a hotel room on Michigan Avenue when his research assistant had sent him the background document on Estelle's Table he had asked for 6 weeks earlier and only just received. He had been carrying that document for 14 hours. Stay with us through the whole video, because what was in that document is the reason this story is not about one day on a bench in January. It is about 46 years. Shaquille Rashawn O'Neal was born in Newark, New Jersey in March of 1972. And before he was anything else, before he was an athlete, before he was a celebrity, before he was a brand, he was a boy in a row house in Newark who knew what it felt like when the heat went off and stayed off and the kitchen got down to the same temperature as the January air outside. He was 6 years old when it happened. His mother, Lucille, was 24. His stepfather, Philip Harrison, was not yet in the picture. It was a week in 1978 that Shaq almost never talks about publicly. A week he has mentioned twice in interviews, each time briefly, each time in the context of something else. The way people mention the things that form them most completely when they're not quite ready to look at them directly. The lights went out on a Tuesday. The heat followed on a Thursday. There was food for 2 days. On the third day, a woman came to the door. Her name was Estelle Graves. She was a friend of Shaq's grandmother, Odessa O'Neal, who everyone called Big Mama. They had known each other since childhood, 2 girls from the same block in Newark who had gone in different directions and stayed in each other's lives across the distance. The way certain friendships survive geography by becoming correspondence, then become something deeper when the geography closes again. Estelle had moved to Chicago in 1971. She had come back to Newark that week to visit Odessa, and Odessa had sent her to the row house on the third day because Odessa was the kind of woman who knew when somebody needed help before they asked for it, and acted before they knew to be grateful. Estelle Graves arrived at the door with 2 grocery bags. She did not announce herself as a savior. She did not perform the act of generosity for an audience. She set the bags on the kitchen counter. She opened the cabinet and found a pot, and she cooked. She fed Lucille and her son. She stayed for 2 hours. She left without making it a story. She said one thing before she went. She said it to Lucille, not to Shaq. But Shaq was 6 feet away and heard every word. "Nobody leaves this table hungry," she said. "Nobody. That's the only rule there is." She went back to Chicago. She started a community table in a church basement on West Madison Street 6 months later in 1977 with $40 and 2 donated pots. She called it Estelle's Table. It was still running on West Madison Street on January 9th, 46 years later, when a man in a broken zippered parka sat down on a bench across the street and looked at the sign above the door and filed it and said nothing. Estelle Graves died in December of 2019. She was 81. The rule she had stated in a Newark kitchen in 1978 was printed on a laminated card and pinned above the door of her kitchen on West Madison Street, where it had remained ever since. Nobody leaves this table hungry. Nobody. Shaq did not know. had never known, in all the years of funding the shelter through Pillar Community Partners, that this was the same kitchen. That the woman who had started it had once stood in his mother's kitchen in Newark and fed him when he was 6 years old. He had learned it the night before, in a hotel room, from a document that included a photograph. Estelle Graves and Odessa O'Neill, 1969, standing in front of a house in Newark, laughing at something off camera. Estelle in a yellow dress. The same photograph that was taped inside the soup kitchen window. He had been feeding this kitchen for 4 years. Estelle's table had fed him first. Rhonda Cates had grown up in Rockford, Illinois, the middle of 3 daughters, and she had wanted, for most of her 20s, to be a chef. Not in the way people say they want things and mean something softer. She had attended culinary school for 14 months at a program in Milwaukee. She had staged in 2 restaurants. She had a binder of recipe development notes she had kept since she was 19 that ran to 230 pages, organized by season and protein and technique. She was talented. Her instructors said so. One of them, a man who had cooked in 2 Michelin-starred kitchens in Lyon, told her she had the palate of someone who had been eating seriously for 40 years. She was 26 when her mother's health collapsed. Not all at once. It never happens all at once. It happened the way health fails, when money is the variable. Slowly and then suddenly, crisis following crisis, each one landing before the last one was resolved. Rhonda left the culinary program. She went home. She worked. She sent money. She visited when she could. She told herself it was temporary, the way people tell themselves things are temporary until enough time passes that the telling runs out of energy. She was 51 now. She had been the assistant manager of Carver's Diner on West Madison Street for 9 years. She was good at the job. The owners trusted her. The morning crew followed her lead without discussion. She ran the floor the way a person runs a floor when they have spent decades learning exactly what it takes to keep something from falling apart, efficiently, without sentiment, with a constant low-level vigilance for the thing that might go wrong next. She had received notice the previous Friday that her mother had been moved to a memory care facility in Rockford. Full-time. The cost was $4,200 a month. Rhonda had done the math in the parking lot of a Walgreens at 11 p.m. That night, sitting in her car with the engine running for warmth, and the math did not close. It had not closed for years, but now it was not closing in a new, final way. She had slept 4 hours. She had come in at 5:30 a.m. She had been on her feet since before the first pot of coffee was ready. At 9:47 a.m., a very large man in a torn coat came through the front door of Carver's Diner and sat down in a booth by the window. She was across the room. She saw him sit down. She saw the coat. She saw the boots. She had been on this block for 9 years, and she recognized a man who had been sleeping outside by the way he held himself in a warm space, the slight loosening of the shoulders, the eyes that moved differently when the temperature was no longer an adversary. She had seen it 100 times. She walked over before any of her servers could get there. "We don't." She started, and then caught herself, and started a different way, and what came out was worse. "People like you bring down the whole block," she said. Her voice was not cruel. It was flat and exhausted and completely certain, the way a voice gets when the person using it has stopped hearing themselves. "I'm going to need you to head on out." There was a busboy named Kevin, 20 years old, first month on the job, still in the phase of the job where he watched everything and cataloged it, who was standing 8 feet away with a tub of dirty dishes. He heard every word. He looked at the large man in the booth. He looked at Rhonda. He did not say anything. The large man looked up at Rhonda. He did not say anything either. "I'll have Kevin walk you out," Rhonda said. Kevin walked him out. The whole restaurant heard it. Forks stopped moving. Coffee cups stayed in the air. A woman named Patricia, retired school teacher, 67 years old, had been coming to this diner every Tuesday and Thursday for 11 years. Always the same booth, always the same order. Watched from her seat by the window. She set her cup down very carefully in its saucer. She did not look away from the door. The documentary crew had the exit on camera. A man in a torn coat walking out of a diner on a January morning while a 20-year-old busboy held the door, the diner's warm lights spilling out and cutting off the moment the door swung closed again. The large man stood on the sidewalk for a moment. He looked up the street. He looked at the sign above the soup kitchen door. Then he crossed the street and went in. He sat at the end of a long folding table. A volunteer named James, 60 years old, retired postal worker, had been volunteering here for 7 years every Tuesday and Thursday, put a tray in front of him without fanfare. Oatmeal, toast, orange juice in a small cup. James moved to the next person. Shaq ate the oatmeal. At the far end of the table, a man named Franklin was having a conversation with nobody, gesturing slightly with one hand. His eyes focused on the middle distance. Next to Franklin, a woman named Rosa was helping an older man cut his toast into smaller pieces with the focused care of someone who has learned to offer help without making it visible. 2 college students in matching orange vests were refilling juice cups from a pitcher, moving in unconscious synchrony, their conversation never stopping. Above the door to the kitchen, laminated and pinned, the card. Nobody leaves this table hungry. Nobody. He sat in Estelle's kitchen for 40 minutes. Nobody recognized him. At 11:30 a.m. Back on the bench outside, a teenager sat down next to him. Her name was Maya. She was 16, tall, with a backpack that had a patch of her high school's logo on it, and below that, a smaller patch of the Chicago skyline that she had iron on, applied herself. Because she thought the official version was missing something. She sat down, took out her phone, looked at it, put it face down on her knee. "You okay?" she said. Not to perform kindness, just the way a person asks when they actually want to know. Shaq looked at her. "Better than this morning," he said. She nodded. She didn't push. She sat with him the way Cecilia had sat with him, without requiring anything of the silence. After a minute, she said, "I volunteer in there on Thursdays." She gestured toward Estelle's table. "The woman who started it, Estelle, she's kind of my hero. She died before I was old enough to meet her, but they have all these pictures inside and stories about her and—" She stopped, looked at her phone. "I don't know. I think about her a lot, like what it means to just decide that one rule is going to be the whole thing. Nobody leaves hungry. That's it. No conditions." Shaq was quiet for a moment. "She was something," he said. Maya looked at him. There was a half-second where something in his voice, the weight in it, something specific in the way he said she was, made her pause. She looked at the size of his hands. She looked at his face. The beard, the cap, the coat. She looked back at her phone, but she was not entirely sure she had looked away from the right thing. Shaq did not move. He kept his eyes on the street. "What's your name?" he said. "Maya, you go to school around here?" "Lincoln Park." "I'm a junior." She paused. "I want to study public health. Because of her. Because of Estelle. Because, the thing is, hunger isn't a food problem, it's a systems problem. And you can't solve it by just adding more tables. You have to." She stopped herself. "Sorry, I talked too much about this." "No," Shaq said. You don't. They sat on the bench for another 20 minutes. The camera crew, a block south, kept rolling. At 1:15 in the afternoon, Kevin, the busboy who had held the door at Carver's Diner, came out of the service entrance on his break. He was wearing his apron still, sitting on a milk crate in the alley, eating something from a paper bag. He saw the large man on the bench across the street. He looked at him for a moment. Then he got up, walked across the street, and sat down on the bench. "Hey," he said. "I'm sorry about earlier. What she said. That was wrong." Shaq looked at him. "You didn't do anything wrong," Shaq said. Kevin nodded, not entirely convinced. She's not a bad person. She's going through something. That doesn't make it okay, but," he stopped. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. Because it's true," Shaq said. "And it matters to you that I know it." Kevin sat with that for a second. "Yeah," he said. Inside the restaurant, at the counter, Patricia, the retired schoolteacher who had watched from her booth, who had set her cup down with such care, who had not looked away from the door, was finishing her coffee. She had been sitting there since it happened, slowly, thinking. She paid her check. She left a slightly larger tip than usual. On the way out, she stopped at the front register, where Rhonda was managing the lunch rush with her back to the room. "Rhonda," Patricia said. Rhonda turned. Patricia looked at her for a moment, not with anger, with something closer to sorrow and older than that, the expression of a woman who has watched too many people make the mistake of taking out what they carry on people who happen to walk through a door. "That man didn't deserve what you said," Patricia told her. Quietly, "You know he didn't." Rhonda opened her mouth, closed it. Patricia left. The door closed behind her. The lunch crowd noise filled the space back in, and Rhonda stood at the register looking at the window that faced West Madison Street, at the bench across the way, at the large man sitting there talking to Kevin, and something moved behind her eyes. Something between recognition and the beginning of the particular shame that comes not from malice, but from exhaustion. The shame of knowing you did the thing you know better than to do. She went back to the floor. She kept working. She was still working when the phone rang at 3 p.m. The call came in on the shelter director's line first. The director was a woman named Carol Reyes, 44 years old, had run the Roosevelt Community Shelter for 6 years, previously spent 11 years in nonprofit housing administration in Minneapolis. She received approximately 12 calls a day and had developed the ability to triage them by tone in the first 4 seconds. The call, at 3 p.m., did not sound like any of the 12 standard categories. The man on the phone identified himself. Then he told her 3 things. The first thing, he told her who Pillar Community Partners was, who had been behind the wire transfers. Carol Reyes sat down. She was already sitting, but she sat differently. The second thing, he told her about Estelle Graves, about Newark in 1978, about the grocery bags and the pot on the stove and the sentence, "Nobody leaves this table hungry. Nobody." Spoken in a kitchen in New Jersey to a 24-year-old woman and her 6-year-old son on the 3rd day with no heat. He told her he had learned all of this the night before, from a document he'd had his research assistant compile, containing a photograph he'd recognized from across a street through a soup kitchen window that morning. Carol Reyes did not say anything for a long time. The third thing he said was simple. "I want Estelle's table to have its own building. Permanent. Owned, not leased. I want it endowed for 30 years of operating costs. And I want it named in full, Estelle Graves Community Table, because the woman who started it fed my family before I was old enough to know I was going to spend my whole life trying to pay it back." He had been fed by this kitchen before he knew it existed. Carol Reyes had worked in nonprofit administration for 17 years. She had received major gift calls before. She had never received one that made her close her eyes and press the phone against her forehead for a moment and breathe. "Okay," she said. Then she asked, "Is there anything you need right now?" There was a pause on the line. "Can you get a message to one of your volunteers?" A 16-year-old named Maya. "Tell her," the man from the bench said. "Public health is the right answer. Don't let anyone talk you out of it." At 3:30 p.m., a silver SUV pulled up to the bench on West Madison Street. The documentary crew stopped filming and started packing. The man on the bench stood up, stretched to his full height, and pulled the wool cap off his head. The beard came off in his hand. He stood in the January cold for a moment, 6'9" in a broken zippered brown parka, looking at the sign above the door of Estelle's table. He went in one more time. He was not invisible anymore. The room changed the way rooms change when they realize all at once what they are looking at. James, the volunteer, stopped walking. A man at the far table stood up from pure instinct. Franklin stopped his private conversation. Rosa looked up from helping the older man with his toast. Shaq walked to the back of the kitchen where a laminated card was pinned above the door. He stood in front of it for a moment. Read it. He reached up, because he was the only person in this building who could do it without a step stool, and he straightened it. It had been slightly off level for long enough that nobody remembered when it had been straight. He leveled it with 2 hands, carefully, until it sat even on its pin. He turned to face the room. "This kitchen fed me when I was 6 years old," he said. "I didn't know it until last night. I've been trying to pay a woman named Estelle back for a long time, and I didn't know it was her." He stopped. "I know it now." He looked around the room. At James, at Franklin, at Rosa and the older man with his toast and the 2 college students in orange vests who had stopped moving. At a volunteer who was crying without having made any sound. "Nobody leaves this table hungry," he said. "That's the only rule there is." It was her rule. It's a good rule. This table isn't going anywhere. He left through the front door. On his way to the SUV, he stopped at Carver's Diner. He went in. The lunch crowd had thinned. Rhonda was at the register. She saw him come through the door, and she went still. Not with fear, with something different. The particular stillness of a person who understands that a moment has arrived and that the only thing left to decide is how they are going to meet it. Shaq walked to the counter. He sat down on a stool. "Coffee?" Rhonda said. "Please," Shaq said. She poured it, set it in front of him. He wrapped both hands around the cup, the same gesture he had used all morning with the cold paper cup on the bench, and he drank it, and he did not perform anything, and he did not make a speech, and he did not make her feel smaller than she already felt. He finished the coffee. He set a folded card on the counter, the Foundation's card, a number written on the back in pen. "The soup kitchen across the street is going to need a catering partner for an annual fundraiser gala they're doing in the spring," he said. "Big room. Nice crowd. The food matters." He stood up. A culinary program director in Milwaukee, named Hargrove, told somebody once that you had the palate of someone who'd been eating seriously for 40 years. That was a long time ago. I'd like to find out if it's still true. Rhonda looked at the card. Then she looked up at him. He was already walking to the door. Kevin, watching from across the room, 20 years old, first month on the job, looked from the door to the card on the counter to Rhonda's face and understood that he had just watched something he was going to describe to people for the rest of his life. On West Madison Street in Chicago, on a January morning, that lasted 6 hours. A retired teacher named Patricia learned that one quiet sentence spoken in the right direction is sometimes the whole act. A busboy named Kevin learned that the moment you walk across the street and say that was wrong is the moment you become the kind of person who does that, and that it is always worth becoming. A 16-year-old named Maya learned from a message she received through a shelter director she had known since she was 13 that the person on the bench had been listening, and that being listened to by someone who sees you clearly is one of the rarest things there is. A woman named Rhonda Cates went home that night and opened, for the first time in 4 years, a binder of recipe development notes organized by season and protein and technique. She did not make any decisions. She just read. She read it the way a person returns to something they had set down and not allowed themselves to miss. And in a hotel room on Michigan Avenue, Shaquille O'Neal sat with a photograph on his phone. The same photograph that was taped inside the soup kitchen window. 2 women in 1969, Estelle Graves in a yellow dress, and he sat with it for a long time. His grandmother and Estelle Graves had been friends for 60 years. Estelle had walked into his mother's kitchen with 2 bags of groceries and 1 rule, and the rule had fed thousands of people on West Madison Street for 46 years, and he had been funding it for 4 of them without knowing whose hands had first held the pots. Some debts don't announce themselves. They just wait, quietly, in a window, taped behind glass, for the day you are finally standing close enough to see them clearly. He'd been fed by this kitchen before he knew it existed. He never forgot where he came from. And neither should you. We want to know. Drop a comment and tell us, is there someone in your life who gave you something without making it a story? A meal, a word, a moment they probably don't even remember? Tell us. We read every one. If this video moved you, it earned the like. You know it did. Hit it. This channel exists for people who believe that the things done quietly, without announcement, without an audience, those are the things that last. If that's you, subscribe, because that's what we build here, every single week. The next one is ready. Don't go anywhere. We will see you there.